April 10, 1963. 220 miles east of Cape Cod, the North Atlantic stretched in every direction like a gray, indifferent mirror. Somewhere beneath its surface, at a depth that no man was ever meant to survive, 129 human beings drew what would be their final breaths. They were sailors, engineers, civilians, some of the most highly trained professionals in the United States military. They were aboard the USS Thresher, the most advanced nuclear-powered attack submarine ever built on a routine deep dive test, and they were about to vanish from the face of the Earth in a matter of seconds. What if the official story was never the whole story? What if the disaster that swallowed the Thresher whole was not simply the result of a faulty pipe fitting or a flooded engine room, but the culmination of buried warnings, suppressed safety reports, and a culture of institutional silence so thick and so deliberate that it would take over 6 decades to begin unraveling? That is precisely what newly declassified Navy documents, quietly released in early 2026 under the Freedom of Information Act, are now beginning to suggest. Files that sat sealed inside the Naval History and Heritage Command for more than 60 years have cracked open a story that the United States government hoped would stay buried as the Thresher itself, 8,000 feet beneath the ocean floor. This is not merely the story of a submarine disaster. This is the story of what America was willing to hide in order to win the Cold War. And we are only now beginning to understand what was lost that morning and why. To understand what happened on April 10th, 1963, you must first understand the world that created the USS Thresher. The early 1960s were not a time of measured caution. They were a time of existential terror dressed up in the language of progress. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik. It had tested hydrogen bombs. Its submarines prowled the Atlantic in numbers that kept American naval commanders awake at night, drenched in cold sweat. The arms race was not a metaphor. It was a daily, grinding, desperate reality. And the United States Navy was losing ground. The response was the Thresher program. The Navy authorized the construction of a new class of attack submarine, faster, deeper diving, and more lethal than anything that had come before. The lead vessel of this class, SSN 593, was laid down at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire in May 1958. She was 5 years in the making. She stretched 278 feet from stem to stern. She displaced nearly 4,000 tons when submerged. She could dive deeper than any American submarine before her, well beyond 1,300 feet, and she carried advanced sonar systems, sub-rock anti-submarine missiles, and a nuclear reactor that hummed with enough energy to power a small city. Billions of dollars in the collective genius of the American military-industrial complex had gone into her construction. She was called the crown jewel of the United States Navy. Admirals described her as the submarine that would tilt the Cold War in America's favor. Journalists were permitted carefully controlled glimpses that suggested a vessel of near mythological capability. The public was told only what they needed to believe: that America was safe, that America was ahead, that America's sailors were protected by the finest engineering minds money could buy. But behind the gleaming press releases and the Admiral's confident briefings, a different reality was taking shape inside the hull of that ship. The Thresher had returned to Portsmouth in July 1962 for a 9-month post-shakedown overhaul, a process during which workers identified more than 800 separate deficiencies and repair items. 800. The shipyard was under extraordinary pressure to meet deadlines. Schedules slipped. Quality checks were rushed. Silver-brazed pipe joints, the connections that held the submarine's seawater systems together under crushing pressure, were tested inadequately, or in some cases, not tested at all. Internal Navy memoranda warned of systemic problems. Those memoranda were filed, and the Thresher was sent back to sea. She was built in the open in the sense that any visitor to Portsmouth could see her long gray hull taking shape in dry dock. And yet the Thresher was in every meaningful way a secret. The exact specifications of her hull design, her diving depth, her weapon systems, her nuclear plant, all of it existed behind walls of classification that would not begin to come down for decades. Workers at Portsmouth signed non-disclosure agreements as a matter of routine. Conversations about technical specifics were discouraged in break rooms and canteens. Even the sailors who would eventually serve aboard her were told only what their specific role required. The left hand was expressly forbidden from knowing what the right hand was doing, because security demanded compartmentalization. And compartmentalization, as it turned out, also prevented anyone from seeing the full picture of what was going wrong. The 800 deficiencies identified during that 9-month overhaul were not a secret in the sense of being deliberately hidden from everyone. They were documented, but the documentation existed in fragments, spread across departments and offices and chains of command that rarely communicated with one another in any integrated way. A quality control inspector might flag a poorly brazed joint. That flag would be noted in his report. His report would travel upward through the hierarchy, where it would encounter the gravitational weight of the schedule. The pressure to get the Thresher back to sea, to demonstrate progress, to show Congress and the public and the Soviet Union that America's submarine program was on track. The flag would be acknowledged, and then quietly the ship would sail. Inside the Thresher, life was cramped, demanding, and, to the men who lived it, utterly absorbing. Commander John Wesley Harvey commanded a crew of 112, supplemented on that April morning by 17 civilian technicians from Portsmouth, who were along to observe the deep dive trials. The submarine was a sealed world unto itself, a pressurized cylinder of steel and electronics in which every cubic foot of space served a purpose. The torpedo room smelled of oil and metal. The control room glowed with instruments. The engineering spaces at the rear of the boat vibrated constantly with the low, insistent thrum of the nuclear plant. These men were professionals of the highest caliber. They had trained for years. They had memorized emergency procedures until those procedures became instinct. They trusted their vessel and they trusted one another because in the submarine service, trust is not a sentiment. It is a survival mechanism. On the morning of April 10th, they had docked the night before at the Naval Station in Groton, Connecticut. They had eaten breakfast. Some had called their families. At approximately 7:47 in the morning, the Thresher submerged and began her descent. The escort vessel on the surface was the USS Skylark, a submarine rescue ship. The two vessels communicated via underwater telephone, a technology that, even by 1963 standards, was imprecise and subject to distortion. The Skylark's crew tracked the Thresher's progress as she descended in stages, pausing at intervals to check her systems. The reports that came up through the water were routine, professional, calm. There was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong, until there was. At approximately 9:13 in the morning, the Skylark received a garbled transmission from the Thresher. The words that could be made out were fragmentary and disturbing, something about minor difficulties, something about attempting to blow. To blow, in submarine parlance, means to use high-pressure air to expel water from the ballast tanks, causing the vessel to rise. It is an emergency procedure. It is what you do when you are in trouble and you need to get to the surface fast. But there was a problem. The Thresher was not rising. She was at or near her test depth. The precise figure remains classified to this day. And the pressure at that depth was incomprehensible. Every square inch of her hull was bearing the weight of hundreds of feet of ocean above it. If a seawater pipe had ruptured, water would have entered the engineering spaces in a torrent powerful enough to short-circuit the electrical systems. A reactor shutdown would have followed automatically. It was designed to do exactly that under certain fault conditions. And without reactor power, without propulsion, without electricity to operate the ballast blow system at full effectiveness, the Thresher would have done what physics demanded. She would have sunk. The Skylark transmitted repeatedly. No coherent response came back. At 9:17 a.m., the crew of the Skylark heard through their underwater telephone equipment a sound that none of them would ever forget. A sound described in subsequent testimony as a muffled rumble, like something vast and hollow collapsing in on itself. Then silence, the kind of silence that has no bottom. What they discovered next was even more disturbing. When rescue and recovery vessels reached the site, they found no survivors. They found no bodies. They found only debris, fragments of internal fittings, insulation material, a rubber glove, pieces of cork, scattered across the ocean floor in a pattern consistent with an implosion so sudden and so total that the vessel had been compressed and shattered in fractions of a second. 129 men had simply ceased to exist. The ocean had taken them, and the ocean had closed over the place where they had been. And the surface of the North Atlantic looked exactly as it had looked before they died. Records tell a different story than the one the Navy initially presented to the public. The official court of inquiry convened immediately after the disaster, but its proceedings were classified. The families of the dead were told that the investigation was ongoing. They were told that answers would come. What they were not told was that internal Navy communications from the months preceding the disaster had explicitly flagged concerns about the quality of brazed pipe joints in the Thresher class, concerns that had been raised, discussed, and then subordinated to the pressure of the schedule. A technical analysis conducted in the aftermath determined that a failure in the engine room seawater piping system was the most probable cause. High-pressure water flooding the engineering spaces, reactor shutdown, loss of power, inability to blow ballast effectively at depth, the chain of causation was reconstructed with painstaking care. But the deeper question, how those pipe joints came to be inadequately tested, who knew about the deficiencies, and why the Thresher was cleared to conduct deep-dive trials despite outstanding concerns. Those questions were answered in classified documents that disappeared into the vaults of the United States government for decades. The Navy reformed its submarine safety program in the wake of the disaster, creating the SubSafe program, a rigorous quality assurance regime that has, by all accounts, been extraordinarily effective. No SubSafe certified submarine has ever been lost. That program is the Thresher's real legacy, and it has saved lives beyond counting. But the institutional impulse to manage the narrative, to protect the Navy's reputation, to frame the disaster as a solvable technical problem rather than a symptom of systemic failure, that impulse shaped the public record for 60 years. The wreck of the USS Thresher lies today at a depth of approximately 8,400 feet, in a location that the United States Navy declines to disclose precisely. The ocean floor in that region is cold, lightless, and under pressure so extreme that it exists in a different physical category from the world we inhabit. In the years following the sinking, the Navy conducted several deep-sea survey operations to document the wreckage, using early remotely operated cameras and eventually more sophisticated submersibles. What they found was both more and less than they expected. The Thresher had not sunk intact. She had imploded, violently, instantaneously, and the wreckage was spread across the seabed in multiple distinct fields, as though she had been unmade from the inside out, sections of hull, fragments of equipment. The debris fields extended across a wide area, suggesting that the implosion had scattered material in multiple directions simultaneously. The reactor compartment, built to exceptional standards of structural integrity even by 1963 specifications, was found to be largely intact. The Navy monitored radiation levels in the area for years afterward. The results of those monitoring operations remain in significant part classified. In more recent decades, there have been reports of unexplained sonar contacts in the general area of the Thresher's last known position, contacts that do not correspond to known shipping or marine life patterns. Whether these represent artifacts of the equipment, natural geological features, or something else entirely, no public explanation has been offered. The Navy maintains that the site is periodically monitored for environmental reasons and that no unusual activity has been detected. The 2026 declassified documents offer no clarification on this specific point, referring only to ongoing environmental monitoring protocols and citing exemptions for operational security reasons. The families of the 129 men who died have, over the decades, organized commemorations, lobbied for greater transparency, and in some cases submitted FOIA requests of their own. Some have received partial responses. Others have received letters explaining that the documents they requested are still classified, or that they have been destroyed in accordance with routine records management schedules. The Navy has maintained a memorial to the Thresher at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. It is a somber and respectful monument. It does not answer the questions that some of those families are still asking. The story of the USS Thresher is, at its surface, a story about engineering failure, about what happens when the pressure to move fast overrides the discipline to move carefully. It is a story about the hidden cost of the Cold War, about the human beings who were asked to operate at the bleeding edge of technology in conditions that were not, as it turns out, as controlled as anyone had told them. It is a story about 129 men who went to work one April morning and never came home. But the 2026 declassifications have made it something more than that. They have made it a story about institutional memory, about the difference between what governments tell the public and what they keep for themselves, about the way that catastrophe can be managed and narrated and quietly absorbed into the official record without ever being fully understood. The SubSafe program that grew from the Thresher's grave has made American submarines safer than any other nation's. That is true, and it matters, but safety programs are responses to failures that have already occurred. They are, by definition, too late for the people who came before them. 129 people paid the price of an institution learning a lesson it should have already known. We know about the USS Thresher because she was found, because her debris fields were documented, because her loss was too large and too public to be buried entirely. We know what the Navy chose to tell us, and now, slowly, we are learning a little more of what it chose not to. But the ocean is vast, and it is patient, and it keeps its secrets with a thoroughness that no government archive can match. We only know about the ones they admitted. What about the ones still hidden?